We are live.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the November 10th Academic Standards Committee meeting. Tonight's topic is student achievement summary from the test results from the 2015-2016 school year. I'm Denise Brooks, the chair of the committee and a board member. So for the benefit of the people who are listening to this at home, we'll just go around the table and introduce ourselves. Please start this way.
Kyle McKessie, board member.
Matt Ferguson, IT director.
Bill Foster, board member.
Margaret Jenks, student.
Wendy Thomas, board.
Ed Tate, board.
Mike Thorwald, board.
Robert Frazier, superintendent.
Sue Elliott, assistant superintendent.
Barry Desko, Director of K-12 Education.
Great, thank you. Before we begin, I just want to pass the baton to Dr. Frazier for a brief statement.
Thank you.
Oh, I'm sorry, and Andy Block on the phone, sorry.
Now you know.
I knew then.
Thank you, Ms. Brooks. Again, this is Robert Frazier, superintendent. And again, this is just a brief statement before we begin here this evening. As many of you know, in the aftermath of Tuesday's presidential election, we have experienced acts of vandalism and harassment that together, quite frankly, constitute acts of hate at Council Rock High School North. I detailed these incidents in a listserv message to the community this afternoon. I cannot emphasize strongly enough how inappropriate these actions are and that they simply will not be tolerated. These incidents have been reported to the Newtown Township Police Department. An investigation is currently being conducted by the police department as well as by the school district itself. My hope is that conversations occur both at home and at school so that collectively we stop any further incidents from occurring. As a school, we will be setting a strong tone first thing tomorrow morning that this kind of behavior is entirely unacceptable and that our community must be based upon a mutual respect for all people and that anything less than that is simply unacceptable. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, we'll start with Dr. Elliott.
Great, thank you. This evening, we're going to really focus on highlighting some of our achievement data from the last year. And tonight, Barry Desko and I are going to highlight student performance on our standardized measures that our students take throughout the years at Council Rock. We're going to conclude the presentation with a brief overview of the Pennsylvania School Performance Profile, as all the assessments that we're reviewing tonight are used to calculate the score of the school performance profile. So you see all these things that come together to make up that score. So we're going to start first with some PSSA information. And what you see here, we're going to look at some data charts and talk a little bit about some of these data and highlight some high-level things with them. So we're going to start with language arts. And the spring of 2016 was the second year that our students took the new PSSA English Language Arts test aligned to the PA Core standards. So the data in this chart here show a comparison of student performance by grade level in Council Rock. The percentages are listed under each year. They indicate the number of students who earned advanced or proficient, or the percentage of students who earned advanced or proficient on the exam. The third and fourth columns show a comparison of our change in performance over those 2 years with that of the state change in performance over the same 2 years. So as you look at these data, you'll notice that in grades 5, 7, and 8, we saw a larger increase in our scores than the state level. And we saw a slight decrease in our performance in 6th grade, while the state saw a slight increase in performance. Our changes in 3rd and 4th grade were relatively comparable to the changes at the state level. A bit later in the presentation, we're going to look at state level rankings to help us better understand how our changes in performance fall relative to districts across the state. So just highlight some of the language arts data. Now we're going to look at the math data. And again, the chart is organized in the same way as language arts, and you'll notice that we increased our performance in all grades except for a slight decrease in 5th grade. We saw more significant increases than the state in our performance in 7th and 8th, and more comparable changes to the state in our performance in grades 4 and 6. So our change in performance was a little less than the state level in some cases. So you'll see some of those comparisons there. Now we'll move to science. So similarly in science, which again, only our 4th and 8th graders take the science test. And just to clarify, the science PSSA was not changed 2 years ago. It has been the same science test for numerous years. Only the math and the language arts test were changed and were a new test 2 years ago. So when we look at our 4th and 8th graders, we had a slight decrease in performance in 4th grade, and that slight decrease was similar to the decrease in the change at the state level. However, we saw a larger increase in our performance for 8th graders for science, while the state saw a slight decrease in performance. So let's look at the keystones. Finally, with the keystones, it's important to understand a couple things about what these data represent. First of all, they represent the 11th grade cohort, or our students who were in 11th grade last year. Those students are currently our seniors. And the students take the Keystone exams at different grades depending upon when they take the course aligned with the Keystone exam. So for example, some 8th graders take the Algebra Keystone in 8th grade when they take algebra, rather than taking it in high school, even though the Keystones are designated as a high school exam. Additionally, these banked scores that you see here, because they represent a cohort of students, they represent each student's best score on the exam. So it's possible that a student has taken one of these exams more than once, and so the scores that are represented here represent the best scores of all the students in this cohort. Understand what this data represents. So one of the things that when you look at this chart compared to the previous charts with the PSSA data that might jump out to you right at the start is, why are there such greater significant changes, increases in our students' performance on the Keystones than on the PSSAs? So it's important to remember that before the state put a pause on requiring the Keystone exam as a graduation requirement, the class of 2017, which is our current seniors, was the first class who had to pass these exams in order to graduate. While this is purely speculation and I have no specific evidence to suggest that this is true, it is possible that these students took it more seriously because they had to pass these exams to graduate, which is why you might see a larger increase or change in the score from year to year.
So this year, it won't be a graduation requirement?
That's correct. It is not for this class of 2017, it's no longer a graduation requirement. The class of 2018, it is currently not a graduation requirement based on the pause that the state took until they finalize what they're going to do with changes in the Keystones. Right now, the class of 2019 has it as a graduation requirement.
So you would expect maybe some downward trend possibly?
Not sure.
So what we did see as an example is when the state put the moratorium on the graduation requirement, far fewer students retake the test. A significant number of students were retaking the test because they knew they needed to pass the test in order to graduate. And as soon as that moratorium went into place, they took it once and stopped.
And the Keystones are handled differently by every school district. So there are school districts out there that graduation requirement or no graduation requirement, the students retake the Keystone exams. Council Rock has never been that kind of school district. So it's never been an apples to apples comparison. So for us, and to Sue's point, the retakes were taking place with the class of 2017. This upcoming year was really only the class of 2018, right? With the data that we're going to see with this upcoming year. So you still had some of that effect. So there might be a drop. I don't think there's going to be that much of a drop because those kids, when they took those tests, they still thought that they were in that cycle. They were a year behind, but it's not like they were 3 years behind. They were only 1 year behind. So I think there might be a slight drop. I don't think there's going to be a significant drop. It's not like it was with the group that was 2 years before, or it will be, for say 3 years behind.
I don't want to belabor the point, but why would school districts require kids to retake? Is there some value to that?
because it helps your school scores.
Okay.
To be quite blunt
No,
about it.
Well, I was
makes
gonna
sense.
ask too, so do you agree with
I
what
don't.
we've done
I do.
historically?
Yeah, without a doubt. Without a doubt. If we're going to be child-centered about the approach, I do. Now, understand too that with our demographics here, that we can afford to do that. When you're in a different kind of school district
Right.
that maybe doesn't have the fortune that we have from a demographic standpoint, then perhaps you feel as though your hand is forced a little bit more. But I know of some school districts that have somewhat anyway comparable demographics that still have been making those kinds of decisions. And do I agree with that approach? I really don't. Because the child-centered thing to do when it's not a graduation requirement is not to retest unless that student wants to retest. Absolutely.
Some of those same districts have kept it as a graduation
Yes.
requirement.
That's true too.
Yes.
They made it a local decision.
We're still giving the test because we think at some point,
We're giving the test because we have to by federal law.
well, we still have to, even though it's not a graduation requirement.
Correct. So by federal law, we have to test students in math and language arts in every grade 3 through 8, and then once in the high school, and then once in science in each of the grade levels, or each of the bands of grade levels, the elementary, so 4th, middle school 8th, and for us, right now, it's the Keystone Biology, which most students take as typically sophomores.
This would show that at least at the high school, maybe middle school level, they're not taking it very seriously. They may not be taking it seriously because it's not a graduation requirement now.
Well, these data suggest that maybe they were, but we'll have to see, and possibly not, as Robert's saying, next year, but maybe,
Right.
a few years from now, we might see a difference. Because a lot of our students, our class of 2018, where the scores, next year's seniors, where the scores will be banked, many of them, they're our current juniors. Most of them have all already taken the Algebra Keystone, many when they were 8th or 9th grade. They've already taken the biology, and they've already taken the literature. So they've taken it at least once. And it's possible that some have retaken, just because of when the timing of the state ruling to pause the graduation requirement came. They may have taken it, but they may not have.
I think too, our younger students are different test takers than our current juniors and seniors because they're more accustomed to it. They've been doing it longer and the stakes have been higher longer for them. I think
Yes.
it's not quite the same sort of culture shock.
So a little bit of a high-level interpretation of these results when you look at it in general. So we've seen some good increases in performance on PSSA in grades 5, 7, and 8 in language arts, and then in grades 3, 7, and 8 in math, and grade 8 in science, and of course all of our keystones we've seen some increases. We've seen some slight decreases in grades 3, 4, and 6 in language arts, and grade 5 in math, and grade 4 in science, but not significant decreases when we look at that data. So when you think about what does this mean, and while I do not have any specific indicators of exactly what led to increases or decreases, I believe that teachers' understanding of the test construction, when you think about the PSSA, it was the second year of the test, so they had a little bit better knowledge of how the test was constructed, the types of questions that are on the test, kinds of the ways that things are asked, that I think that may have influenced some of the increases because they have a little bit better understanding of then how to help prepare kids for the types of things they're going to see. And that's not saying that our teachers taught to the test. It's saying that they now understand how questions are worded and can incorporate that kind of instruction into their daily instruction to support students. So now that we've kind of looked at the achievement aspect of it, just relative to our district with a comparison to the state growth, we're going to now take a look at state level rankings of data. So I'm going to show you some charts, but then I'm going to take some of the data from those charts and show it in bar graphs, so in a pictorial form, because I think that it's a little bit easier to digest. So in this chart, you see 6 columns, and you're going to see this in the next couple charts. Each pair of columns looks at our ranking relative to all of the school districts across the state of Pennsylvania. So for example, here in in the first two rows, those are just taking what our percentage of students who are advanced and proficient are from 2015 to 2016. Now, when it talks about the English language arts test there in the first row, it's taking the data and converting all of the raw scores of all of our students grades 3 through 8 and figuring out what our total percentage of advanced and proficient students were on the English language arts test for all grades. Same with math and same with science. And then of course the Keystone represents that 11th grade cohort again. So those data look similar. The second two columns look at what our rank was relative to all the school districts in the state. In most cases, it's either 499 or 500 school districts. The reason that that number is just slightly different is because in some of the data sets from the state, there were some issues with some of the values and some of the numbers from some of the school districts that I couldn't calculate their ranking because something was missing in the data set. So I excluded any where the data set was missing some piece of data. And then the last two columns, you see the state percent. What that shows is where we fall. So for example, in the first row, in 2015 for the English language arts test, we were within the top 9% of the state of school districts. And then in 16, we moved to the top 8.4%. So we'll now look at some graphs that actually depict that.
So on that, I mean, these graphs will be the same information.
Yes, the graphs will be the same information.
So when you go back to that table, and I know you talked about it before, the keystones. I mean, so here the hypothesis is it's a test that we started carrying out. And different things happen, like retests occur at a higher frequency than in the past. And so, you know, it's an obvious statement, but when you care about something, you can make significant improvement. And I know that that's an obvious statement, but you know, to see going, so either everyone else in the state was already caring as much in 2015 as 2016, or intrinsically, then caring doesn't matter as much as it does for us. So, you know, that we're able to put on the gas in a way that others can't, or couldn't, or didn't.
But Bill, it was a requirement in 2015 also. It's just been eliminated now. It was, oh no, it was 2017, right, never mind.
Yeah, and honestly,
It's the same.
Bill, I don't know that I can make that kind of a statement. I think that's too hard to say that we care more than somebody else.
I'm saying either we all care the same and we're intrinsically able to do better, or you know, we care more, or whatever. But those are huge changes in a single year.
Yes.
And so it's interesting what can happen when we focus. If the decision is, do you want to focus? And that's the big one. Anyway, so.
Thanks. So we'll look at what I did with this chart is I did not create in the bar graph a chart of comparing the percentage of students that were advanced or proficient. So we're just really, or actually I did, I'm sorry, I misspoke. This chart is just the percentage of students who are advanced and proficient, to kind of separate some of the data out, because in some of these bar graphs, like in this one, for example, you want to see the second column increase. You want to see it go up. In the other ones, you want to actually see it go down. So here you just see overall a pictorial representation of our changes in the percentage of students advanced and proficient. The next chart shows our district, our rank relative to other districts in the state. So when you look at this graph, the first column shows you the 2015 state rank, and the second column in the grouping shows you the 2016 state rank. So when you see this, you see that all of the tested subjects, when we put all the grade levels together, we've seen an improvement in our state ranking. Some more significant than others, as you see from the Keystones, where you see some significant changes in the ranking. And then when we look at the next chart, this shows where we fall, what percent we fall in the state. So again, when you look across all subjects, you see a decrease or an improvement in our ranking, our percent ranking relative to the state. And of course, with the Keystones, you see a more significant change in that ranking. Now, what we're gonna look at next is actually taking those state rankings and looking at them by grade level.
Before you move on.
Yes.
Because this is something, I know that these tests aren't always the same from year to year. Have you looked at more than 2 years?
With the PSSA, we can't really look at more than 2 years because 2015 was the first year of the new test, so it wouldn't be appropriate to compare.
Agreed, but you could compare the ranking relative to the rest of the state, and that should be a valid performance.
Yeah, oh, absolutely, yes.
These are great, but it's hard to see a trend with 2 data points.
You're right.
And I'm looking, I think we can pull a trend out of some of this data. I recognize in the test change, there are some inherent, but this is a metric that should be extent indifferent to what the test is. It's just relative to everyone else. So this is kind of normalized for you already. And I'm wondering if we've looked at, I guess I'm asking if we looked at that, because we would like to see these.
Yes.
I mean, it may be steep and then level off. At some point, you get diminishing returns, but.
Yeah, let me answer this, and I'll answer this for the whole group. We're going to do that. What I'll tell you is that all this data that you see here are district rankings. In order to do that, you need district level data. The state does not give us district level data. They used to give us district level data until, what, 3 or 4 years ago? I guess they stopped.
Yes.
Every year since then, I've personally gone to the state and said, where's our district level data? Because since 2000 or 2001, they always gave us that district data. We always used it exactly for that purpose. You can see that longitudinal kind of trend line that you were looking for, and then all of a sudden they stopped. And every year since then, they've refused. This year again, about 3 weeks ago, 4 weeks ago, I went to PDE and I said, where's the district level data? Since we have a new administration there, once again, the answer came back no. So Dr. Elliott herself has gone through this data for each of the past 2 years, and she's generated the rankings. So we will be going through and doing the previous years, but I'm going to tell you that it's just manual labor, and it falls. Yeah, I know, and I know that you appreciate it because you're a numbers guy. But this honestly falls outside of her job description, and I know that Saturdays and Sundays have been spent doing this. So it was yeoman's work just to get this ready, these 2 years done for this presentation. But you're spot on with the question that you're asking.
And you can take it further once you have, if you have the data. You can compare our schools too. What are the trends from
Yes.
individual schools?
Exactly.
And start to figure out what's working, what's not. But
So,
in a gross sense.
Yes, absolutely.
Gross
Oh,
sense.
absolutely, yes.
I would say one thing though, Mike, that I've seen in the 8 years is I think it's very hard to compare a test that means consequentially something to the student and one that doesn't in any grade over 7. And so, you know, it's just, we bribe them
'cause
with
we know that-
pretzels, we give them all, I mean, Barry knows more than I do, all the things we've done to try to make those tests important. But I feel like now we're gonna be in this anomaly where the tests didn't need it for graduation, now they need it for graduation. If they don't again, we're gonna flip. And we're not gonna know reasons other than intuitively that the student doesn't absolutely require it. And so it makes it hard for me to say, what does the data mean to me? I almost feel, for me, the more important comparison is among our own schools, is among our schools to each other. Are we, because I don't know what kind of conclusion you can draw from this when you have such a huge difference in scores at the high school level from one year to the next. It's not like, oh, we all of a sudden started teaching, I mean, you know, better, or it has to be that.
It does speak to the fact of it being required, because we know, even just for many years of reviewing the PSSA data, before there was even Keystones, that, you know, the numbers fell in the high school, and if you tracked it back and looked at those high school students when they were in elementary school, you saw there was a disconnect between
Not even that.
their performance, like, what, did they get that dramatically?
Well,
poor
when compared to
performance?
the SATs, they weren't parallel.
Right.
So the student would perform at one level in the SAT and not nearly as well in the PSSAs. So it's a logical conclusion, but I feel like it's just hard to get anything meaningful
it's hard when there's only two numbers, I will tell you that.
Even if there were
Yes.
four,
It's-
it wasn't required.
Well-
It went from not being required to being required.
We could switch this around and toss the PSSAs and go to our standardized district level test.
Well, yes, so
I don't-
that stuff would be
I
more
mean,
meaningful.
I've never seen more than 2 years of that compared to mine. That's what, that showed that there's something in there, but you have to look at it. And I recognize it's a lot of work. It's not, please don't,
I'm just
I don't want to
saying,
beat you up.
it has
That's
to
not
be
fair.
equalized data.
Yeah.
The data has to be taken under the same conditions, and when you significantly alter the conditions, it's hard to draw a conclusion from the data.
And then there's a cultural thing too to keep our eyes on. So as Wendy's saying, I mean, we all agree it's valuable to compare across our schools because it's a similar school population. You have cases out there where these rankings can become suspect if the culture in the state changes. So even though I love Centennial, and I love the superintendent of Centennial, he's made a decision that to advise parents to opt out of these tests. He thinks that these tests really just measure socioeconomic conditions. And you might as well look at people's tax returns and then report that number. So, I mean, it's a strong position. He absolutely believes it. So, over time, as that culture takes hold in Centennial, comparing to Centennial doesn't mean anything about yourself. So it's that kind of strangeness that.
Agreed.
Well, looking at the steepness of some of these, I think they're almost suspect from the get-go.
Yeah.
We don't make those kind of improvements in a 1 year. I mean, it's just,
It's not human nature.
yeah.
But it is interesting because if you look at the PSSA stuff, because in elementary school, I don't think the kids know, and they're not thinking about that. Because to them, it's a test, you have to take it seriously. And so, I mean, it's anecdotal, of course, but there is something to it. And we know when our kids were in high school, when my kids took those tests, I mean, I don't think they wouldn't like come out basic or below basic. They wouldn't like totally bomb it. But like, they all talk about it. They knew that the test didn't count. It was taken away class time.
I'm okay, like I said, with switching to something that means something, and I'm looking at it from a grade level. I mean, I don't want to compare first grade through high school. I want to take first or second grade for the last 10 years, as I said, and see, are we improving or are we not improving? So not a particular.
Well, I think it's not
trend.
highlighted here, but I think it's safe to say that they are looking at the data to see that, so that there is continuous improvement, but it's
Well,
not. So.
And I would say, I'd be willing to say, what do you think you should spend your time on? Because just because, and I love to see more than 2 data points, but I just want to have all the same conditions so I can draw conclusions from it. I don't want to have you spend time, and it's not going to mean anything because something dramatically changed in the middle of it. So I guess that's where I am.
Yeah, I agree.
I'd rather have you tell us,
What's the
I spent my
most
time
improved?
doing these 3 things more extensively because this is what I can pull from them, than me try to figure it out, you know better than I do.
And that's what I want to hear as well, like where is the biggest bang for your time? That's-
Well, and I agree with what you're saying, Mike. I think it's important to look at more years of data to
And this
really,
may be the
to really
wrong
look
data
at
set.
trends. And, right,
Yeah.
to really look at trends. But what I think, when you talk about spending time, looking at having only been here for 3 months so far, the balancing out where to spend my time, getting the data, this state level data with just the 2 years for all of the assessments. And of course, what you're going to see next is actually state rankings by grade level. So it dug further down deep into the data. That was enough of a focus on this for right now for me to help us understand, help me understand kind of what do I know about the district and how our students perform.
Yeah, that wasn't an ask. I don't.
No, I know. I understand that,
Yeah, that's
yes.
not, yeah.
And I agree with you, I would tend to want to have more as well so that we can look at those trends over time.
And hence my discussion of the district test, because we pay for software, we should have all that somewhere. Performance tracker that allows us to.
Right, so we would have district data and performance tracker, but like as Robert said, we wouldn't have the ability to look at any state
No,
level stuff.
and we need to concentrate on our district anyway, so, my thinking is, are we continuously improving? or not, you know, and realizing it's a different cohort every year, there's, you know, there's all those things that go into that. But again, not an ask.
Yeah.
Not an ask.
I think it's twofold. The continuous improvement piece, I think, is important. And the other one, you know, I'll point to PSSA science. So we just improved by what, about 7 percentile points there, right? Up to the 14th percentile, which is good, or the inverse there, 86 percentile. So, but I would say this, I don't care what the assessment is. It could be PSSA, it can be Keystones, it can be SAT, ACT, it can be our district assessment, whatever it is that has some normalized component to it, that we have a comparative basis to it. If we're talking about the state of Pennsylvania as that comparative element, knowing our demographics and knowing the demographics of this state, we shouldn't be outside the top 5%.
No.
And we certainly shouldn't be outside the top 10%. So even with that improvement that you see, we're at 14%.
You're saying it's not good enough.
I don't think so.
Good.
No.
That's good.
And so you see some of the other ones in the 30%. So that's, you know, that's just a thought process that regardless of what the assessment is. Now, I don't know how strong I want to be with that with certain assessments.
Sure.
Because certain assessments have certain problems in terms of how they're used or misused or overused, right? And we're talking about some of those. But the point still remains that with our demographics relative to the demographics of this state, we really shouldn't ever be outside the top 10%. And we should really be living in that top 5%. And in some cases we are, and in some cases we aren't. And so that should be a point of analysis, and that's where the historical look back would, I think, probably be helpful and beneficial to us.
Well, what I feel like is more concern, like it's actually, like, well, the PSSA math scores, like when I took, like, well, the graphic that showed, like, well, the percentage of students who scored advanced and proficient, well, like, the math was, like, not that much. Not that much greater than 50%, really. It was like 60, maybe something like that. Like it was maybe it's easier to see if you go back to the slides perhaps. But like
Yes, you're talking about the chart that shows.
yes, because I mean, I do agree with Dr. Cruiser about like, well, like what. Because with our demographics, maybe we should be like doing better compared to other schools. But I feel like that like the test could also be used really to evaluate like how we're performing just like within ourselves. Like that the PSSA tests basic math skills, and that's not the significantly fewer amount of our students who reach that standard in math. It's like it concerns me.
Right, well, the math test, again, it was a new test 2 years ago. And the trend across the state with the math test was that the scores significantly dropped across the state. So that's why when you look at those data, it's also important to look at how we rank and where we are percentage-wise. Because you look at, okay, so 62.2% of our students were advanced or proficient, but yet we're in the top, almost within the top 10% of the state in performance. So that means that pretty much everybody scored that poorly on the PSSA math. So part of that has to do with the new test construction, how they set performance standards for that test. And, you know, every district experienced this very similar large drops in student performance in math, much greater drops in math than they did in the language arts. There were also some drops in the language arts test last year compared to the test the year before, but not as significant as math.
Yes, like are we trying to do better than other districts, or are we trying to do well as for our districts?
Well, I think the statewide comparisons are important to identify, not so much on a competitive level, but to identify deficiencies. So you spoke about the data that the State Department of Ed is not providing. Is there anything that we as a board could do to help get that data? Because it sounds like valuable data that you're not getting.
I'll be happy to give you the contact information.
I mean, it's also pretty silly.
I absolutely.
I mean, it's crazy because they have the data. It's
No,
not even like
absolutely,
it's
yeah.
that
So you
difficult.
feel like it's like push 3 buttons and make it add
I
together and
absolutely
send it
will,
out.
I absolutely will, and I also would give it to our state representative and our state senator, and saying, you know, we're not
It's
getting.
it's frustrating, because you have all these school districts that now are running it themselves, instead of the state.
It's a waste of time and resources, exactly.
But Margaret, to answer your question, the answer is both. We're always looking to continue to improve everything for our students. That's our mission. It's always to increase the performance of our students. The net effect, of course, is that also helps us with the state. And that is very often the basis by which we are compared. So we can't just ignore it. It's just one piece of the things that we use to make decisions on how to continuously improve the education for our students. But I mean, it is actually pretty remarkable to see that in any objective term, the number of students that were advanced or proficient in math it was like a C grade, right? And yet it's so highly rated. So it speaks to some of the deficiencies of other mechanisms and not necessarily our students.
Yes, although and not that I'm standing here being a proponent of the test, but I do know that some of the challenge with math test in particular was because the level of rigor of the test was so much greater than what the previous test had been. That's why you saw the significant change, because of how it's aligned to the new standards.
Yeah. We raised the bar.
We raised the bar, and you saw that.
And that shows how Council Rock responds to the state data to raise the bar for our students and with the state.
Great, so let's move on to, this is back to the language arts test. Now you'll see state rankings by grade level, just to kind of break that data down a little bit. So the next chart, I didn't include in the next chart the percentage of advanced and proficient students. So now we're just going to look at the rank and the percent, our percentile. So you've got 4 columns together, and the first group of columns you see there, that's 3rd grade. So the first 2 columns in each group are the state rank, 2015 to 2016. And then the second 2 columns that are all the smaller columns are the percent, where we fell in the percent of our performance. So what you notice now, if you remember from the charts from looking at all ELA together, we had an increase in all of the subjects. We had an increase, or an improvement, I should say, in our ranking. So a decrease in our ranking in the state to a better ranking and a good improvement in the percentile. However, when you look grade by grade, now you see, and kind of Mike, this is what you're talking about, looking more, digging into some grade level specific things. Now you notice that there are some grades here, in particular we look at 6th grade. So 6th grade, our ranking actually is a little worse when we go from 15 to 16. Now, when we think about that, that speaks to, questions about what's happening, what do we notice about this? But it's important to kind of think about all these pieces of data together and what the picture is that they tell all together, rather than trying to single any one thing out. So if you remember from earlier, we saw, we see here significant decreases in 5th grade and 8th grade, and that was something that we also saw in the performance of students. Those were some achievement grades where we saw some good achievement improvements as well. So this gives you a picture of grade by grade for language arts. Now we're going to move on to math. And again, looking at the picture for math, we see here that you see some places where our ranking actually did not improve, it got a little worse, and places where we improved our ranking. And if you look at, for example, this is where you kind of want to ask some questions. So if we look particularly at 5th grade, which is the 3rd column from the left. So so we saw an increase in our students earning advanced and proficient in every grade except 5th when we looked at achievement data. So when you think about in 5th grade, we saw it was like a 1% decline from 15 to 16. So when considered along with the state rankings that we look at here, we see that, we saw decreases in state rankings in only 2 grades. So 7th grade and 8th grade. And those were the grades with the most significant change in their performance. We had 6 to 8 percentage points of increase in performance. So these data suggest that in some cases, while our students improved their performance on the PSSA math relative to the performance in 2015, other districts across the state had greater levels of improvement. So when our ranking shifts like that and it doesn't seem to quite coincide with our achievement, then maybe there are some shifts in how other districts were performing, that they either jumped above us in ranking or we jumped above them in ranking. And keep in mind, a lot of the numbers in these rankings, the percentages, they're so close in percentages when you look at the rankings of 500 school districts. It's important to keep that in mind.
The scores are very similar, a small change in the score.
Correct.
Make a large change in rank.
It could, yes.
Can I put you on the spot, and you don't have to answer if you don't want to. Does that speak to curriculum? Change in curriculum? I see 6 and 7 and 8 become a problem. We've changed math curriculum. The delivery of mathematics changes from 6 to 7 and 8. And you don't have to answer, but my mind wanders to, are we delivering our education differently, and that causes this disjointure here in the.
Yeah, and Mike and I can't, at this point,
I
can't answer that question.
I said I was putting you on the spot.
Yes. I think looking at data like this, at this point, really bring questions to mind. Things like that to start thinking about. Okay, so what could this mean?
I don't expect to have an answer. Yeah.
What do we know about, what do we know about changes across grade levels? Or what do we know about, like, for example, if we would say, implement a new curriculum, a new program in a grade level, and we potentially see drops in scores for a period of time because teachers are getting used to new curriculum, or maybe the reverse is true. We implement the new curriculum and we see a sudden increase in student performance. It's too hard for me right now to look at these data and make that kind of a.
I'm thinking back, Barry, to when we kicked in Envision Math, which
It's been quite a few years.
It would be nice to track that ripple through the years to see what did that do? Is it,
Across grades 3, 4, and 5.
Yeah, because 6th grade's not in that.
Correct.
So
Right.
it is an interesting thing, but 6th grade was already sort of using a middle school approach, a tech, right?
Yes.
So-
something different.
Yeah, but they're still in elementary school, so the delivery of education changed from 6 to 7.
No question, but I'm just saying that in terms of the curriculum of the text and the 6th grade is not in the same grouping as the others.
Yes. So all questions that are swirling around in my mind. Yes.
Mine too, and I'm just verbalizing it. That's okay. So,
All right. So let's look at science by grade level, just to finish up the PSSA assessments. So again, when we look at the chart, again, we just have 2 grades here because only 4th and 8th grade. So the first group of 4 columns on the left represents 4th grade, and then 8th grade is represented on the right. So there again, you see, and this is, some of what Robert spoke to, we see, talking about a district like ours, we should be within the top 5% or no more than the top 10% of performance. And, while we are, think about our 4th grade science scores, they're in the 90s. And it's like 91, 92, something like that. But yet our percentage were in the top 13% of the state. So when you think about that relative to how well students across the state perform on the science PSSA, it kind of leads again to questions about what does that mean and what lessons can we learn from that. So when we think about just some kind of high level thinking about those ranking results. So overall, when you look across a test, having all of the grade levels together, we see that our state rankings improved across all of the tests over the 2 years. And that as a district, when we look across all the grades, as a single grade, when we look at the test, all of our tests or all of our scores fell within the top 15%. But when we broke things out a little bit, that's where we saw some differentials in how grade levels were. Our Keystone rankings fall within the top 10% of the state. And then most of our individual grades, we had a couple that weren't, but most of our individual grades were within the top 20% of the state. And we kind of look more high level at these data. So we've looked at achievement relative with the PSSA, and then we've looked here kind of ranking with the state. So now we're gonna take a very quick look at growth. And I'm gonna do it quickly because there's a lot of charts to just kind of take a quick gander at with growth. So Pennsylvania uses the Pennsylvania Value Added Assessment System. And that system tracks student growth and not achievement. So this isn't looking at percentage of kids that were advanced or proficient. This looks at our kids growing a year for a year. Now, I will tell you that they use a very complex formula to figure this out. I cannot even begin to explain it to you or understand it myself. But the PVAS really looks at how kids perform from year to year. And did we see growth? Meaning, did they make at least a year's growth in a year's time? So what you're going to see on the next couple slides are a bunch of pie charts. And the pie charts are going to show 3 colors. So each color represents a level of growth. So as noted here on this slide, the green, if you see green, it indicates that there's evidence. So keep in mind, it's evidence that it's not sure, it's just suggested evidence that the group met the standard for academic growth. If you see a blue slice of the pie, there's moderate evidence that the group exceeded the standard for academic growth, which in essence means they made more than a year's growth in a year's time. And if you see the reddish pinkish tone, that is moderate evidence that the group did not meet the standard for academic growth, which means they made less than a year's growth in a year's time. So you're also going to see on each pie chart 5 sections. What the state does is divides the data, all the data into quintiles. So instead of, quartiles, they divide it into 20%, quintiles, and have from the lowest to the highest. It's how they present the data. So you're going to see five slices of pie.
So I just want to make sure,
Yes.
so people understand, this has nothing to do with the student's achievement level.
Correct.
So you could achieve at an advanced level, but still show a red in your growth.
The concept behind this was we owe everyone a year's worth of growth. And so nobody gets left behind. I mean, it's the nobody
Correct.
gets left behind. So you're right. I mean,
Yes.
you could be at the top of your game, but if you didn't grow, you would be red.
By 4 years,
Yes.
that's correct.
I think they've made a mess of this, but that was the idea.
Correct,
right?
yes.
Yes. So we're going to take a quick look at this and not dwell too much on it, but just to clarify what you see here. So we're looking at the 4th grade language arts pie chart. So you see the 5 numbers, and you notice how the sizes of the slice of pie are different. That represents the number of students that we have in each of those quintiles. So the first quintile is the lowest quintile, the lowest performing students, and the 5th quintile is the highest performing students. So when you look at 4th grade, we have more students in the 5th quintile than we do in the 1st quintile. And of course, it looks like more in the 5th than in the 2nd, the 3rd, or the 4th. So the size of the slice has to do with number of students. Now you add the color layer on this. So when you look at just the 4th grade, and we'll use that as the point of reference for this, and then I'm going to go through some of them a little bit faster, is when you look at these data, so our students in the 1st quintile, so our lowest performing students, that is green, which suggests that they made a year's growth in a year's time. Adversely, you look at our 5th quintile, which is our highest performing students. Most of those students would typically earn advanced or high proficient on the PSSA. They're red or pink. That suggests that there's moderate evidence that they did not make a year's growth in a year's time. That does not mean they didn't get advanced. They probably still got advanced or high proficient, because there could be some high proficient kids in that slice. But based on the growth model and the calculations that they use, it suggests that those kids didn't make enough growth to warrant a year's growth in a year's time. So that gives you a sense of of what that data looks like. So again, there's, the next pie is grade 5, and then you see grade 6 and grade 7. So again, you've got usually a larger slice of pie in the 5th and the 4th and the 3rd, and typically a much smaller slice of pie in the first quintile. And then here's grade 8 and the Keystone Literature exam. So what's interesting to see is you remember what our Keystone performance was. Very good. I believe it's in the upper 80s. So our top performing kids in high school, when they took this, probably their sophomore year, so they didn't make a year's growth in a year's time according to the growth model. So now we can kind of try to pick apart what are the problems with people see with this growth model, but we're not going to do that for this evening. So that's language arts.
But the problems are significant.
I'm sorry?
The problems are probably significant in the growth model.
I'm not really comfortable speaking about that because I don't know it well enough to be able to talk about.
Well, that's step one, that none of us can actually talk about.
Yeah.
And so that's concerning. And then, I mean, it's, I don't think it's a criticism. I mean, having thought about it, it's almost impenetrable. And then as you use your imagination, there's so many ways this can go off the rails. And I don't want to take up any time, but I have deep concerns about this academic thing.
Well, and that's why you need to look at even this piece of data relative to everything.
But
Like
sometimes.
not isolating this out, but thinking about, okay, what does this suggest? What kind of questions can this lead us to explore and think about?
I mean, I agree with that sentiment in general, but sometimes you get kinds of data streams that actually that's being too generous, where it's just kind of a noise. So I'm concerned that this is that kind of data stream, but we can talk about it later.
I would say the first thing we need to do is, does it make sense? Is it even sensical, so.
So I
Like,
I would completely agree with Bill, based on the presentations we've had in the past about what this data is. The concern I have is we're presenting it tonight, so it's out there, and somebody's gonna say your whole eighth grade is red. What are you doing? Nobody in 8th grade made a year's worth of progress. And so I think it's important if you're gonna put the data out there to be able to explain it, or at some future time say we're going to delve deeper and explain it. But if I'm a member of the public, this is nothing but concerning, and I don't understand it.
Well, and that's why trying to explain it in this presentation that, as Barry said, it's not about achievement and percentage of students that are advanced or proficient. It's looking at growth. And while I agree with you, we've put this out there for the public to see, and we have actually some links at the end of the presentation that if folks want to on their own go and look into some things a little bit further, they can do that to get a little bit better understanding. Particularly the PBOS site, that there are things that they can, like tutorials they can listen to and things to try to understand what the data is as well. So there are some opportunities if people are interested in understanding that.
And probably the information is public, so I mean, if we didn't include the,
Well, I'm just saying, okay, but when's the meeting that we have where we interpret this? Like, we had this last year, similar concerns. And we said, okay, you're gonna go back, you're gonna reevaluate it, you're gonna look. Now, granted, we didn't have enough staff, and one could argue we still don't, but like, it's almost starting to become to me like, okay, so what? So what? It's meaningless. And so unless we're going to say at some point, have another meeting where the presentation is, okay, this data set doesn't mean anything, we're taking them out. This is the one that right now, we're just presenting information for information's sake.
Right. Well, the important thing to remember about this is PBOS is part of the school performance profile. So it is part of how our school is evaluated.
Yep.
And not only is it part of it, it's 40 points.
Yeah.
So that's I guess that's my struggle. So if we don't want this to be presented as part of the data presentation, then we're choosing to omit 40% of the school performance profile. Now the SPP will be changing for next year, but we don't know how it's changing for next year. So in terms of the 2015-16 data set that we're presenting on, This is 40% of the school performance profile.
Okay,
So I'm not sure how
I
we
guess, so
present
what's
this
our
data
goal?
without.
Is our goal to inform the board about how we're ranked and why we're ranked that way? Is our goal to look at student achievement and what we could do better? Like,
The goal is to provide an overview of 2015-16 data.
But we have an interest in what's the best use of the data to move things forward. And this is more informational. And I don't want to go down the rabbit hole, but I just want to say why I'm so, one example of why I'm so suspicious of this. So you're going to measure a year's worth of growth. How you measure that, you only have a certain number of test questions. So I've got a second grader and a fifth grader and a 10th grader. I don't have so much real estate on a test to make this measurement of what a year's growth is. And I'm suspicious that I can do that across all of these different kinds of abilities and years. It's nonsensical.
Well,
So
it's probably important to understand what the year's growth measures. It's really about how a student or a cohort group of students remain in comparison to that same cohort across the state. So really, it's looking, the colors that you see and the growth that students make or a cohort grade level is based on how Council Rock students moved up, down, or stayed the same in comparison to all other students in that same
But I guess
testing.
my point is that people make 100% on the tests, right? You suddenly have saturated your measurement.
Yes.
And you can't, and so it's not flat across, it doesn't have the same sensitivity, there's a bunch of other stuff though. I'm just really suspicious.
I am too.
Yeah.
I just don't know how we provide a data presentation without at least providing an overview of this.
I don't think,
That's all.
I
I don't like the data either. You know,
Well, it's
and
gonna
I
cause
wish
a
it
lot of-
wasn't included.
it's gonna cause a lot of, if people are paying attention, and that's probably questionable this week anyway, but it's gonna cause a lot of questions.
I mean, I agree on that, but
I
it's
have about
it's in
45
context.
questions in my head right now, and I understand it better than the average person.
But it's also in context. I mean, yes, these, you know, of course, we don't want to see the red, but it is in the context because there are other pieces of data here that they all come together and lead to something, and we see all these other pieces. Some of these grade levels did exceptionally well. We saw improvement, we saw, you know, there's things to be garnered from all the different pieces that come together. It just so happens when you lay it down in these quintiles, it's just another piece of data. So, I mean, I do understand what you're saying. None of us want to see the red. It doesn't help.
But then when I see it, I wanna say, okay, what does it mean? And what am I
Right.
doing about it? That's what I really wanna know. I don't mind seeing red, I just wanna know, so what?
And those are really good questions, and I think that what they invite us to think about when you look at this relative to all the data. So our student achievement is high in you know, pick a particular grade or subject. But then when you look at the corresponding PVOS growth chart that you look at here, and you see areas of red, then you start to wonder and think about the students in those different quintiles. So we have really good achievement, like, you know, we looked at that 4th grade language arts example. So we had some good achievement and improvement in 4th grade, but our highest performing students didn't make a year's growth in a year's time. So then that leads us to think about questions about, all right, so for our most, you know, talented readers, or, you know, in the case of the language arts test, what's happening? What can we do? What can we do to maybe increase their growth so that they show more growth than they are? It doesn't mean that they're not achieving well, it's just, okay. And on the adverse, so our lowest performing students are making more than a year's growth in a year's time, or if they're green, a year's growth in a year's time. What are we doing? Like, let's talk, let's celebrate and find out what are the things that we are doing for our lowest performing students who are showing growth, which in many cases, sometimes that's the group that we sometimes have the hardest time with. Because when you look at those slices of the pie chart, for example, here with 5th grade math, so we've got our first quintile and our second are green. Well, it's very possible that those students still were not proficient on the PSSA, but they made growth. So what happened? What did we do? What was our instruction like? How did we work together collaboratively in our buildings to support those students?
And what happened to the other 3 quintiles?
Right,
Like,
and then
we
let's-
left, we maybe, did something different that did
Correct.
not keep them on a trajectory.
So we can invite some conversations and discussions with teachers or among administrators and the curriculum coordinators to start thinking about, well, let's think about what this could mean. And let's look at all of these pieces of data together. Our rankings with the state, our achievement, and our growth to think about what's the large picture of the message here that helps us understand achievement from a broader perspective relative to just this one test. Granted, it's just this one test because PBOS is all about the PSSA or the Keystone, not anything else. So we haven't even gotten to any of the other tests yet that are part of the SPP, but the PSSA and the PBOS, that's a large chunk of what the SPP is.
Will next steps be part of this discussion?
Yes. at
So
the
I,
end, we can talk a little bit about that.
I feel like that, when we get to that place, that will help some of the concerns in terms of that
Absolutely.
we don't have the overview in a vacuum. I'm sure you have next steps and at least thoughts of where you're going with the data that you've
Yes.
provided.
Yes. All right, so continuing with math, again, just getting a quick look at some of the data. And then we go into science, so grade 4 and grade 8. And then, of course, we have the Keystone biology exam as the last pie chart that we have there. So when we think about just these data in general and some general thoughts about it. So our lowest performing students, that's looking at the first and the second quintiles, are most consistently meeting or exceeding the growth standard. Not always, but most consistently. And then our middle to our highest performing students in the third and the fifth quintiles are not as consistently meeting or exceeding that standard for growth. So it's, again, invites questions of let's think about what are we noticing trends and patterns across grade levels. And again, you can also here look at, when you look at 2 different subject areas, or 3 in the case of adding science, like you can look across, say, all 4th grade, language arts, math, and science. Are there similarities in the different quintiles of growth across those 4 grades? It could speak to some different things about cohorts of students. So there's a lot of questions and a lot of things that we can start to explore when we think about these data. So we're going to move to the other data that is part of the PSS or the SPP with the SATs and some other things. But before we do that, I want to emphasize that the different ways we looked at the PSSA and the Keystone data, as I said, help us create that greater picture of what these data mean relative to the state, relative to trends in student growth. And as I said earlier, in my 3rd month here in the district, I can't speak to specific details linked to the increases or the decreases. But this look at the data invites a lot of questions for further explanation. For example, how do we support our lowest performing students? What are we doing, as I said earlier? Or when we think about 7th and 8th grade and some of the significant growth that we saw there, what was the cause of that? Like, what do we think led to that? How can we explore that a little bit further? So those are things that, as I ask these questions, and you talked earlier about what to prioritize in my work here, those questions help drive me to think about, okay, what are some things I want to find more out about and learn a little bit more about what our programming is like and how our students are responding to that. So we're going to move on to take charge of that. Barry's going to talk a little bit about the SATs.
So unlike the PSSA and Keystone exams, these next several assessments we're going to look at are not taken by all of our students. Although, fortunately, we have a good number of students that participate in SAT, ACT, and our AP exams. But again, it's a narrower focus of who we are as a district because it is a much smaller cohort group. So in this particular case, this is giving you a sense of a 5-year trend of our SAT scores. It's important to know that as we move forward that the SAT is transitioning. So we're going to see, again, it's going to be harder now as we go into the future years to make this longitudinal comparison because the SAT is shifting to an optional essay, a math, and then the reading, writing, language component is being combined. So it's going back to a 1600 rather than a 2400 score, and the essay will be an optional for students that choose to take it, like it is in the ACT, and you'll see that in a moment. So right now, we are able to compare test to test. In 2 years, that's going to be much more difficult as we transition out. And in between, we're going to have students who have taken both assessments. So you can see our trends are from year to year pretty similar, obviously, and as we would hope and expect, higher than what we see across the state. So our kids do fairly well in the SAT on an annual basis, and we would expect that that would continue. What we are pleased with that is probably a little bit unique to Council Rock than a lot of other districts are the number of students that take the SAT. You know, we have 90-some% of our students who take the SAT. So although this isn't 100%, almost 100% like the PSSA and or the Keystone exam, it's good representation of our entire group. And these scores that you see up here are for senior classes up through testing in May of their senior year.
How's that compare to other districts in terms of percentage of kids that take the test?
It varies. In higher performing districts, obviously you have a much higher group taking it, because if you have 95% of your students going on to post-secondary education, they're taking this test, the ACT or both. Although you're seeing the trend, you probably see it if you have neighbors or you yourself have kids, that some colleges are beginning to make this optional, weighting it less. So over time, this may have a bearing on the number of students that choose to take the test and or what these scores look like.
So what's our significant takeaway from this?
Twofold. One is that consistently year to year, we perform higher than the state average,
Which one's the state? What color? I'm sorry, I can't read.
the state average, if you look,
It's the
it's in the third column.
It's the short stack.
In other words, this would be the state
Okay, got it.
for the verbal.
Got
This
it.
would be north, south,
Yep.
state, north,
Got it,
south, state, et
Yep,
cetera. Yes.
got it, yep.
So that, the takeaway is that our trend lines remain relatively high year to year. We don't see huge deviations. And then consistently, we're well above the state average for both of our high schools.
There's a third.
So,
Well, year to year, your CAGR's increasing, it's a positive trend.
Well,
You get some ebbs and flows, but it's.
yeah, but they're not huge. There's nothing significant that concerns us that we're seeing a huge spike or huge decline in any one graduating class.
right, so
For their
doesn't tell
No,
me,
there's
I don't
some
have any
growth.
takeaways from it.
There's
We're
a
consistent.
difference
That's-
between north and
that's it.
south, and it's repeatable every year.
Yes, north
There is a
consistently
third
scores
base.
higher than
I think it looks
south.
like writing's improving generally, but that's probably because it was new and people got.
And going away.
Talking, yeah. Brilliant.
Well, and even when it was there, most colleges weren't
Yeah.
looking at it anyway.
Agreed, yeah.
That's positive.
So the next one, to give you another picture now, the ACT, we didn't have students participating in the ACT at all a few years back. So this is, kind of a new trend in the East Coast. The ACT was predominant in the Midwest and West. SAT was predominant in the East. Now you have more students in Council Rock, as you can see the trend growing each year, taking either the ACT only and or taking the ACT and SAT. The reason being is that some students do score better on one test than the other. So this is subject oriented. You can see there's a science and a reading and a math and an English score. Ultimately, the composite score that you see over here is a kind of a cumulative picture of a student's level of performance on the ACT. And again, you can see that our trend lines are good. We consistently are growing in the ACT, both in each of the individual tests as well as in the composite score. Again, both being well above what are the state averages. Still a far fewer number of students take the ACT than the SAT. Okay? So we won't go over each of these, but there's two slides that break down all of our AP test areas. So a couple of things that are important to see here. You'll see that we offer a pretty wide array of AP courses for our students. I think we're up to about 24. In addition to that, you can see the number of tests taken in each of those areas. The next line are the percent of students that take the test that score 3, 4, or 5. We use 3, 4, or 5 because that's relatively considered what is, some people would call it passing, but it really gives an indication of the student's ability to do college level work. And if a college or university does accept an AP exam to either accelerate a student through courses or to provide them credit for courses 3, 4, or 5, and it could vary, some will pick 4 or 5, but 3, 4, or 5 would be the scores that they would use to determine providing that to the student that's attending there. And then lastly, I'm sorry.
I know the answer. You drop 3 out of there and just look at 4 or 5, and those scores change dramatically. Those percentages.
They would change. I don't know about dramatically, but they would change. We have a lot of students scoring 4 and 5.
So you're looking at the
You
average.
can look at the average and.
Yeah, they would change.
Yeah, well, you see over here, right, because this is, but you see a lot of the 4 averages, and part of it's going to be how many, where you have 117 students scoring, over 4, obviously it's going to have a greater impact on that number than
Then
the
the
other.
5
So,
scoring
right.
3.2.
so these are our average test scores. So I'll give you just a second to take a peek at those, and then we'll advance it to the next test areas. Very good. Okay. And again, I think it's interesting to see 1,400 tests taken between our 2 high schools.
That was just last year.
Yes.
I'd love to
So
see,
that's not 1,400
love to
students.
see the number of 3,
Correct.
4, and 5s in the next column, but it's got to be very high. Well, it is. I mean,
I feel like
percentages,
more-
it is very high.
Yes.
Five.
Say again?
I feel like more and more schools are doing 4 and 5.
Yeah, most.
It does subject depend too.
Yeah.
So this will give you, again, a 4-year trend of 2 things, or several things, actually. The number of students that we enroll in AP, and please note down the bottom that students could be counted 2, 3, 4, 5 times, because some students will take a second, third, fourth. We do have students who take 5 AP courses in either their junior or senior year. So of that group, these are the number of test takers. So obviously, some of these students took more than 1 AP test. Then the number of exams taken, the number of scores, percentage of scores, and compared to the state. So a couple of things I think are important to read through this. One is that even though our enrollment declines significantly more, we have a higher percentage of our students, again, counting doubles, triples, taking AP courses. So that is a good trend. In addition to that, we see that a good number, well, we know that a good number of those students not only take the course, but take the test. Now, there are reasons why we're seeing some students opt out of the test, which would actually increase the number of students that participate. But what we're finding out as you talk to our AP teachers is if they're a senior and they've already been selected their college and been accepted, if that college is already not good, if you're going to an Ivy League school, they're not taking any of this, they just choose not to pay the $90 and take the test. And we know that those kids are likely going to score 3, 4, or 5. So that's factored into our thinking, but it does,
It's not in the data.
yeah, it's not in the data. So, and again, you can see that our trend line of students scoring 3, 4, 5 is pretty steady and growing, which is nice. And it far exceeds what would be the state average for those exams. Okay, move on. Give you just a sense of that. So as we indicated that we're performing above both state and national level on these AP exams, and the high percentage of our students that score 3 or higher. And we do a lot of work with the administrators and the teachers where we look and see how a student's grade is reflected versus their score on the exam. If we see students that are getting A's in the course, but scoring a 2 on the exam, that draws concern for us. So our administrators do a lot of comparisons and work with teachers to look at that data to see if it makes sense.
You would like their grade in class to be reflective of what their AP score is.
Yes.
some.
If they took the test right.
Yeah.
I feel like the teachers are very focused on that.
Oh, they are.
I think
They are,
so.
yes.
Yeah.
They take it seriously, and it's a very difficult course to teach because it leaves no room for error. That test happens early in May,
Right.
so you don't get a full year, and that curriculum's got to be covered from start to finish if these students are going to be able to score a 3, 4, or 5.
For instance, the BC Calc, that's almost 8 college credits of calculus.
Yeah, because it includes AB.
If the kid says they want to take it and the child hasn't done that well, I think the teacher has a serious conversation with the kid. I mean, that's my perception. I don't think it's about these scores, don't get me wrong, but why spend $90 if
Correct.
the kid hasn't done well? You benefit from taking the class again when you get to college. Like,
But I think
I
people
feel
ration,
like the teachers are very good at guiding the kids through those AP situations.
and some kids recognize that in themselves, but sometimes, you know, they'll take it and say, well, for $90, if I happen to do well,
Right.
it's worth a lot, and
Absolutely.
there's no downside if you don't do well, other than it reflects poorly on our stats. But it doesn't affect the student.
Right.
I think it also impacts the personal pride of the teachers. They take those scores
Yeah.
very
It's really
seriously.
Oh, for
They
sure.
really do.
No,
That's
that's-
a measurement that they take very seriously. So,
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I don't want to forget the kids that are taking 3 and 4 exams. I mean, it's $270, $360 to take those tests. You know, so that starts factoring into our students that are taking a heavy load of APs, especially in their senior year.
Right, and we know that the rationale for how the numbers are absolutely has a play if you're a senior versus in a lower grade, because the highest number of students taking an exam is the AP Lit, AP Lang, which is an 11th grade class where the students don't know where they're going. So they all take it, they see, hey, they do. And then you're taking AP Lang in 12th grade, and most schools, even if they do take the credit, they're not taking 2 Englishes.
Right.
So, you know, there is a strategy to the exams, and I know I've been in the counseling office. You register to take the exams, you know, in February or March or something, and then you get your college admissions, and then they're getting refunds, because once you know where you're going, if you don't want to take the test, why spend the money?
Okay, so now we're going to move on to what you heard a lot about today or tonight so far, the school performance profile. So it's important to know that, and you heard reference to this a couple of times, that everything that goes into this, most of what goes into the school performance profile is based on Keystone exams and PSSA. And the design of the school performance profile remains the same as it was since it was implemented a few years back. What we do know, or what we anticipate happening, is what Dr. Fraser mentioned, in that we're expecting some change to how they will configure the school performance profile and what will make up that score. So we had opportunities to weigh in with the state and give some opinions and ask some questions. We're hopeful that we'll know what that is now, because actually what we may be scored on next year, we don't even know yet. So it's hard to even prepare yourself and determine where to put any of your efforts if you're concerned about improving your SPP score, because we don't know what the makeup of that report card will be. So what we're going to look at is what's currently in place, knowing that it could be changing next year. And it's important to note up there that scores decline statewide at elementaries and middle schools across the state. And we'll give you a quick reason as to why. So some of what you're going to see in the SPP, you'll probably be able to connect if you can remember back to how the school, what our scores look like with the PSSA and Keystone exams, as well as what the PVAS scores look like, because all of that is what is going to make up these scores. So it's important first to get a sense of how the score is calculated. So we won't go through all of those, but on the left-hand side, you see the data element. And the reason, like it says math or algebra 1, is because it is either the PSSA math or the Keystone algebra 1. So if you are in 8th grade, you have a little bit of both of those. So a middle school would have a small percent coming out of their Keystone algebra 1 and the rest coming out of their PSSA math. But if you're the high school, it's only going to be your Keystone algebra 1. So you can see the breakdown in the percents that make up a grand total of 40% solely based on academic performance. So all of that goes into place is pulled from the number of students scoring proficient or advanced. And then the grade 3 reading for elementary school only is because there's a sense, at least in terms of why and how they utilized this particular data point was that a student's reading level at 3rd grade based on Proficient or Advanced is a good picture of the K-3 program and how well students will likely perform moving forward. So that's why that was brought in as a data point. And then obviously the SAT, ACT benchmark is solely for high school. So there's a different breakdown of percentages assigned to each of those areas, all based on academic achievement. So the next area, closing the achievement gap, and I'll draw attention to the note on the left. So this is in place for two groupings of students. One is the overall student population, and it's a repeat for students that are part of our underperforming student groups. So that would be any student who is ELL, socioeconomic disadvantaged, or special ed. So they're not counted multiple times. If you fit all 3 of those categories, you fall only as a single data point in making that up. So ultimately, the short of this is that the intent is, if you remember the original No Child Left Behind, the intent was to get everybody to 100% proficiency. So this calculation is designed to look at where a cohort group of students are, and then to get them to 100%, they take half of that over 6 years, and the school must close that gap by that percentage in each of the tested subjects. If they don't, then they have a negative number. If they do, then they make that positive number. If you don't make it, you have to make it up the following year, or you'll continue to fall further behind. And then there's a recalculation after the 6 years. So that's what that's about. So that 10%, and again, it's based on the testing of both the Keystone exams and the PSSA, but that's what that 5% makeup is, and then 5% again for the underperforming group. Then you have the PVAS component of it. So this is about growth. So this is all based on looking at when you saw those groupings of students and the blues and the greens and the reds or pinks, that's where this percent of the score comes from. Other academic indicators, so this is not related to PSSA or Keystone exams. This 10%, so you saw that 90% is all based on how our students are performing or growing in relation to Keystone exams and PSSAs, basically. And then this 10% are some other areas, so the cohort graduation rate, so tracking students once they enter 9th grade, how long does it take them to get out of high school and graduate. You can see promotion rate, attendance rate, PSAT, and the AP scores and how they factor in for our schools. So those percentages weigh in accordingly to high school, middle school, and elementary school. And then lastly, there's an extra credit component up to 7 points. So not all of the levels can each get to 7 points, but you can see what they are. So when you score a very high percentage of advanced students in any one of the tested areas, you can pick up an extra point and add to your score. So 100, people would think, would be your highest score. At a high school, you can actually score 107. Okay? So this is going to, we'll look at the elementary, middle, and high school. So 2 things that it's important to draw attention to. You won't see 2015 up there. And the reason why you don't see 2015 up there is because the state did not release school performance profile scores for elementary and middle school. The reason they didn't do that was because that's when the test was reconfigured. So we're not surprised, and anybody who knew this was coming wouldn't be surprised to see a decline in the 2016 score. If they did release an SPP score last year, you probably would have seen an even larger decline in that score, because most districts had not yet fully aligned curriculum to the new test. So this decline that we're seeing is probably not as significant as we would have realized if the SPP was released last year for the elementary school. So you get a sense of each of the schools' scores. Same at the middle schools. Those tests also were realigned so that they did not receive a middle school score. You see the high school scores. Now the 2015 score would connect as you saw those 2015 Keystone exam scores. So you saw that decline, and then we saw the jump. So you see the same here. You see the 2015 SPP was lower because we saw that lower percentage of students scoring proficient and advanced in that cohort group. And then we saw those scores go up last year. And now there's that reflection in the 2016 school performance profile. So there are scores for SPP. And again, across the board at the elementary and middle school, less one, we saw that decline that we were anticipating. So now moving forward, we have a better sense of what that score is. So next year's comparison will be a better look for us and give us a better sense of how our schools are doing, same test to same test. The downside is if they change how we're doing the SPP score, then now we again lose the comparison. So that's kind of been a theme with what we do with the state is as they change the test scores, as they change the weightings in the school performance profile, as they actually change the full school performance profile, it's hard for us looking at these scores from year to year longitudinally and knowing that we can make some good comparisons because the data points just keep changing for us.
So do you have a sense why the elementary schools consistently fell significantly? I understand it's based on the test, but why one school improved and one held steadily, relatively steady? So Goodnow seemed like a lower percentage drop and Hillcrest went up.
You'd have to look, well, you got to look at each of the data points.
No, I understand that, but fundamentally, you guys get stuck out there that.
Yeah, in any school, there's not a lot of commonality to it. Some of it is based on the PVAS, so their performance levels or their growth levels were the data point that pulled their scores down. Others were the proficiency rates. So each of them are different, and that's what we look at. So each of them are being looked at separately and distinctly based on what made up their score.
Could you show the PVAS breakdown again, please? I think it's like 3 slides back.
It's 40%.
Yeah.
Maybe those two schools.
Thank you.
But it's like,
Some people ask why the 20% for the ELA, why that's more important. And if you remember, we used to have a reading and writing component. Now that they've combined it, they just added those in terms of that percent.
But Andy's question, for me, that kind of variation you're seeing where some schools don't change and some schools change by 20 points. I lose, again, I personally lose confidence in whatever this is, because if you take those scores seriously, it has to send you in all kinds of crazy directions. It defies logic that these schools would behave so distinctly. And we can say, oh, the test changed. Well, yeah, but it changed for all the schools. And there's something really goofy and troubling to me. So who's the customer for the school performance profile? Is it the federal government? Is it the public? Like
Who's it designed
who's the
for?
consumer? Yeah.
For the public.
Okay, so
Yeah, this is for the public.
have they given them something useless?
When the federal government issued through No Child Left Behind what states had to comply with, they then gave states an opportunity to provide a program that they would implement and that the federal government could accept to meet those standards. So this is what Pennsylvania came up with, their teacher evaluation system, the school performance profile, where we test, when we test, all those
It's
things.
like a whole package.
Yes, that application had to be approved at the federal level for Pennsylvania to put this into place.
But there's no sanctions if our SPP starts doing this or that. It's
Not based on SPP.
Okay.
And really, the federal legislation really ties it to Title I. So, it would have very minimal effect here in Council Rock.
And isn't there like a warning system, like you get a warning or you get a?
Used to be, yeah.
Yeah.
So
we're not
the
on that
system
anymore.
now, no, and it's actually with ESSA, it's actually changing again. But what the system was with how Barry said this was connected to Title I. So depending upon your school performance profile score, then you were ranked as a Title I school. So you could have been ranked as a priority or a focus school, which means that you fell, if I get my terms correct, So a priority school was within the bottom 10% of all of the Title I schools in the state. And a focus school was in the bottom 5%. So those schools, because they were in that category, were required to do some comprehensive planning and some work to, like, how are you going to improve? On the opposite side of that, they also recognized, with all these data in the SPP, reward schools. So you could be identified as a reward school for high achievement, meaning percentage of students who are advanced and proficient, or a reward school for growth. You met your PVOS growth indicators. And then those schools were eligible to apply for some additional grant monies that they could then use to support continued efforts in their work. So the state was able to tie some money to that. The reward schools were like the top 5 and 10% of Title I schools, and it's only Title I schools, not all schools. And then everybody else in the middle was non-identified, didn't have an identifier, they're just in the middle. So that was different from what they used to do, where you would get a warning, you'd be in corrective action. So the state's now changing it again with the ESSA legislation and based on what the federal government is having us do. And so the identifiers of your lowest performing schools are going to have new names to them. So we'll have to get used to new names again and what that means and what's tied to that.
So one other piece that we thought would again be interesting, because you hear a lot about this every time we approach testing season. So you see the 3-year trend, because prior to that, I don't know that we had anything to even track in terms of the parent or student opt-out request. So 2 years ago, you see we had 10 students opt out. A year ago, we had 35 students, and last year we had 154 students, or 154. And you can see that the number of schools from which those students are coming is growing too. This is also a trend at the state level. We did try to contact the state to get that data. They haven't provided that to us. We wanted to see if that was growing from year to year. We anticipate that it was, based on all that you read and saw, and even from the surrounding districts, everybody saw an increase. We're probably still relatively small in that percent of students that opt out compared to many districts, but ours, as you can see, did grow significantly from the previous year.
I wonder why we don't encourage people to opt out. I mean, it doesn't feel like the data's meaningful or worth anything.
The opt-out, again, is still tied solely to a religious objection to the testing. And we do have a lot of people who say, I'm not lying. I don't want my kid taking the test, but I'm not going to lie. So I think a lot of people are put into that predicament of, having to say that they have a religious objection, and they have to review the test to state that.
But I'm just saying, like,
Right.
it's hard to feel very supportive of any of it when the data gets presented. It's like it feels meaningless.
Well, and you can't get the data from the state that would.
None of it looks good for us. Nothing that was put up there tonight, in my opinion, looked good for us. To your point, we should be in the top 5%. I don't see, were we in the top 5 in one category? The next level, year over year progress, by far and away, we had 3 times as much red as we did blue. We had some green, so the data feels negative and then feels somewhat meaningless. So, I'm
Is it
I'm
meaningless
looking to
because
the,
it's negative, or it's meaningless because?
well, because it feels like, to Bill's point, like we don't even know what they're using and how they're using it, and I don't know. I'm not really sure what I walk away from, but it doesn't feel very positive as far as how we did.
I mean, I think that's the key point, is that we know in this data, or at least we think we know, and some of it it's a useless waste of time, SPPs, some of the PBAS stuff, but hiding if we believe the tests are aligned to the core curriculum, and that's the curriculum we basically believe in, and we believe that the PSSAs and the Keystones actually have some value, but you don't get that value through SPPs.
Right.
So we haven't really talked about where the value is and how we get at it.
I guess that's.
But if there is no value, we shouldn't do the testing. We should encourage people to opt out. But maybe there is.
I feel like it was the same conversation a year ago. I mean, the good news in all this was the AP stuff was stellar. I mean, in my opinion, and consistent. The SATs are consistent.
We've given you about.
Other than that, I don't know. I don't know what I was walking away with.
Well, she's gone about an inch below the surface, I mean, to paraphrase, and we need to go feet below the surface. I mean, but that requires time and effort.
Well,
And
I'm
there's
not blaming
information in
anybody
there,
here, I'm
but-
just saying, like, I'm not really sure if somebody says to me in the community, you know, I saw the presentation online. I don't even know what I would say about it. I don't-
Honestly, I disagree with you because I don't think the picture is nearly as grim as what you're making it sound. I think that, first of all, the Keystone exams were tremendous improvement. And I think by and large, there was growth. The fact that when you see those red things, that doesn't mean that scores declined. Those scores could have gone up. It may not have gone up enough relative to the formula that the state dictates is the threshold that should be met. But I mean, to me, I think the takeaway is this is data that we now have someone working dedicated to teaching and learning to use to see how to direct good decision-making going forward on our curriculum. So, I mean, I honestly think, I mean, we do see these numbers every year, but I think it's more comprehensive this year. I think it is, you know, I think Dr. Elliott has pointed out certain directions that she's going to take and questions that she's asking that it will help guide us on how we improve. And so the question becomes, how does it look next year now that we've got this focus? And how does it look next year when, for the majority of the tests, you're comparing tests that are, you know, the same playing field versus old test, new test? I mean, do we think as a district that like there's too much testing? Yeah, I mean, I don't think that's nobody's going to argue that. Are kids tested too long, too many, too young? Yeah, but this is the field that we're in. And I just respectfully, I just disagree. I don't think it's nearly as, there's always room for improvement. I don't think it's as grim as.
So we're supposed to be in the top 5%.
Well, that's what we're working towards, of course. I mean,
How do you know you're in the top 5% if you don't do this?
Well, I mean,
I'm not saying we shouldn't do it, I'm just saying, what am I supposed to walk away with? What am I walking away? My
you're walking away
impression-
that our state ranks in almost every area improved. So we are working towards a goal of being in the top 5%. That's what I think.
Okay.
but we presumably,
I mean, let's be real. When we talk about being in the top 5%, that is not a conversation that ever happened in any way until Robert brought that to us. And he's been here 1 year. So
I didn't know it was a goal we were getting to. I understood the statement to be, based on where we are and what we do, we should be there.
because
That's what I heard.
but I mean, that's what he brought to the table to us.
And we're not, why not? And
Yeah.
what do we have? This is a measure, this is a tool to figure out why we're not.
My
No,
takeaway
it's
is
a
that
tool to
we,
say we're not there. It's not a tool to figure it out, not so far.
yeah, well, my takeaway from tonight is that we have somebody with a high level of expertise who's dedicated to analyzing this data, however flawed it may be. And that's a subject for another discussion. I'm curious as to your personal opinions about, I mean, I would wonder if the PSSA for math is more valid than the PSSA for language. I mean, you know, before we really start making a lot of judgments, I'd be curious. But I just think it's great that we finally have somebody who's doing this.
When you talk about the PSSA and the Keystone compared to, say, like the SAT or the ACT, and think about test development, design, and construction, all were designed in very same kinds of ways. The way Pennsylvania contracts with the Data Recognition Corporation, who actually designed tests for a lot of other places, not just Pennsylvania. And the test construction of the PSSA and the Keystones goes through a lot of steps and a lot of statistical analyses. You know, embedded within every PSSA and Keystone are field test questions that they always review and constantly look at, reviewing different questions to see if they're valid to keep in the test, to take out of the test. They involve teachers and administrators and leaders from across the state of Pennsylvania to be part of those kinds of conversations. I've been fortunate to be part of them and help with some of that work. So I can tell you that it's a very, very strict process. You know, we are quarantined in a room and we are not allowed to take anything out of the room with us. You have to sign waivers of confidentiality, like all of the things that would be part of the construction of tests like the SAT and ACT are all part of how those tests are constructed. The difference in the math and the language arts tests that were the changes, there are some questions about whether or not it was made too hard. I think the better question to, when you want to look at the change in the scores from the new PSSA to the old PSSA, a better comparison or thinking about that would be to look back to the very first year that we gave the PSSA, which I think was in 1999 or 2000. What were the scores like then when we first gave the test? Where were our percentages then? And are the percentages of where we were with the new test relative to where kids were when they first started taking it? Or are they better? And what do we know about that? So that would be something that would be a more interesting comparison when you're thinking about the test in general and not specifically just our district. But I think when we look at, and I'm gonna skip to this slide, we're talking all night about, so what do we do with this? What does this mean? And we think about action steps. And you know, one of the first things I think that is important for us to think about what we're doing is the work that we're doing right now with the first critical question for learning for PLCs, which is what is most essential for students to learn, is what our teachers are working on right now. They are spending time, and they just did it on Tuesday, digging into the standards, unpacking what the standards are saying, determining what's most essential for our students to learn, and really making sure they understand what does that look like. So if we determine, and I typically gravitate towards language arts examples since that's been my wheelhouse of study, but so if we think about a writing in, say, 4th grade, and 4th graders being able to write a strong narrative piece, what does that look like? And the teachers are spending time having conversations with each other. Okay, let's talk about what that looks like. When a student can do that, let's get clarity on what that means. What should we see in a piece of writing? Or when a student can successfully meet an art standard that might be being able to use different tools and different medium to create something. What does that look like? So the teachers are spending time digging into making sure they understand what the standards mean, thinking about what that looks like for our students, and that's going to lead them to being able to really have more clarity and focus on student learning, which should have an impact on how our students perform on these assessments, because we're linking our thinking about what's most essential to learning to the standards that are part of these assessments. Secondly, I think it's important for us to consider the ways that we can kind of unpack these further. So each of the assessments, the PSSA and the Keystones, are divided into anchors or types of eligible content. So there's categories of test questions, and teachers can look at the categories of test questions and see, how are my students doing on these types of test questions? So for example, in math, one of the categories is algebraic concepts. Well, how did our students perform in that particular category? Do we see any strengths or weaknesses in some of the different areas? And let's look at our curriculum and see how, are we addressing that effectively, or do we need to think about that? So teachers can do that kind of unpacking along with the help of the curriculum coordinators to really think about some of those strengths and areas of need. And also, when we've looked at tonight across different grade levels and some of those areas, it's important to kind of unpack some of those differences in achievement across grade levels. What do we notice? And sometimes it's as simple as, sometimes we know some things about a cohort of students that speaks to why they might be performing the way they are. But there also would be some other things that are factors that within a building, within a grade level, that as teachers talk about it and look at trends, they think about things that are happening within that grade level. So those are all things that are action steps that we need to start doing. Some of them we're already doing, and some of them I think our teachers are starting to do a little bit more of that digging into things. But again, that takes time to be able to do that. And that's something that, you know, for teachers as well, it's for them prioritizing, like, what do I need to focus on right now? And, you know, unpacking all the data down to the minutia might not be what's most important at the moment. So I think that those are some of the key action steps. For me, this raises, again, lots of questions that I add to my list of things to help me continue to further understand our district and what our strengths and our needs are as a district as I continue to learn. And this all is a piece of it that helps me kind of think about what we need to do and how I can support our students and our teachers. So the last slide that we have in the presentation is actually links to the websites where a lot of this data came from tonight. So the first one, the Pennsylvania Department of Education, the link will actually take you to the assessment part of the website. And then once you're there, you can kind of dig into, so there's a lot of things that you can look at. So there's a lot of state level data charts. There are a lot of things that get to district level data. There's some, previous year's data. So depending on how you navigate within that and what you want to do, you can really dig into some stuff. The PVAS, the Pennsylvania Value Added Assessment System, when you go to that, you go to the public site, and one of the first things you'll see on the public site is lots of tutorials, where if you want to, there's a tutorial there, if you want to understand how the growth model is calculated, you can listen to the tutorial for how the growth model is calculated. There are a lot of other things that you can look at and listen to there. They're very well done, put together, and are very informative. And then lastly is the school performance profile. And in the school performance profile, when you go into that site, some of you talked tonight about looking across schools. It's a public site. Anybody can go in and look at any school across the state of Pennsylvania and look at all of their data that's there on the school performance profile. So you can compare any school that you want to. You can compare within the district. You can also compare with schools outside of the district if you want to take a look at how things compare, and it breaks it all down for you and explains it to you. So those sites could be a resource for folks to use if they want to dig a little bit more into some of this data if they feel so inclined to do so. We thank you for your attention tonight and looking at all of this, that sometimes all this data these numbers and things can get overwhelming with how many different charts. But it just gives us a good picture of a review of where we were last year and compared to the year before in some cases. And I think the points tonight that some of you made about getting more years of data is something that we definitely will continue to do to kind of put together and get a better longitudinal idea of where we are. So are there any other questions about what we've shared tonight?
It's a comment and a request. So when the state burdens us with things like the SDP and, in my opinion, PVAS, it creates a lot of clutter in our world. And hearing that in this testing regime that we're a part of, that actually we believe in the tests, that we're not asking our kids to opt out, that there's meaningful connections of those tests to our curriculum, is important to hear if we believe that. And because it underpins the idea that we want to be in the top 5%. Otherwise, if we don't believe that, then we don't want to be in the top 5%. So that discussion about that there actually is value there gets completely hampered by the inclusion of stuff that doesn't have value. So we from chat, we need to separate it out. And if it's all chat, we should know that. And so it makes it much harder for everyone involved if there's this clutter. And so it falls on you to say, is there value here?
And I think it falls on all of us.
Yeah.
So I'll start, and then I'm going to ask the board to also chime in. I don't think it's healthy to go too far in any one direction, personally. I believe, Ms. Brooks, you said something along these lines earlier. I believe that we over-test. Right now, Sue, you said it earlier, we test in grades 3 through 8 in language arts and in math. I don't think we should test in all 6 of those grade levels. I think it's too much. I do believe that we start testing too early. I believe the best, for Frequency of testing would be grade 4, again in grade 8, and then 1 grade in high school as we do now. I think that would be the best balance of testing. Unfortunately, we have no control over that. Harrisburg has no control over that. That's a federal legislation. That's the old NCLB, and it even predates that. So that piece is what it is. So we're stuck with the system that we have. The question is, what do we do with the system that we have? What I do not believe in is teaching to the test. I don't believe in running out and buying practice books. I don't believe in setting up our own practice tests or anything along those lines. There are a lot of schools who do that. There are a lot of schools that you'll find in the top 1% who that's why they're in the top 1%, or one of the reasons why they're in the top 1%. I don't want us to be that. I don't want us to be a school or a school district who's chasing test scores. That said, I do believe that our demographics indicate that we should be in the top 5%. So I think we should at least be somewhere in that zip code. I think we should at least be somewhere within that realm. Can I live with the top 10%? Absolutely, I can live with the top 10%. So what I don't want to do is sell out. If we have 25 other school districts, because that's how many can be in the top 5%, right? 25 out of 500 can be in the top 5%. If there are 25 other school districts who have really good demographics and they're all chasing test scores, then I don't want to be in the top 5%. It's as simple as that. I don't know that that's the case. So if we can do business the right way and still find ourselves in that top 5%, maybe top 6, maybe top 7, somewhere in that neighborhood, then that seems to me to be the place that we want to be. We're not selling out. We're not teaching to the test. We're not going out and buying a bunch of PSSA coach books or any nonsense like that. We're not setting up a bunch of worksheets and drilling and killing. We're just doing the right kinds of teaching, the right kinds of authentic teaching and learning tasks. But we're making sure that we understand the standards, that we understand what is on the assessments, and through the totality of our instruction, we make sure that the alignment is there. But the rigor of our instruction and the content of our instruction goes well beyond what's on that assessment, well beyond, because we're Council Rock. And it should go well beyond what's on that assessment. But one of the things I need to know from this board, and I think we need to know from this board, is where's the board when it comes to this topic? Because trust me, I'll be happy to wipe my hands of this test, of all these tests. I'll be more than happy. I'll take that pressure off my back. I'm sure Barry and Sue will take that pressure right off their backs. So if you tell us to do that, you'll have a happy superintendent going home this evening. That doesn't mean I'm going to rush out and encourage parents to opt out, because I don't think it's the right thing to do. So we had parent advisory on Monday evening, and a parent asked a question there who's new to parent advisory, because we talked about this last year in parent advisory. And so what I tell parents is it's a personal decision. It's your prerogative. If you believe it's right for your child to be opted out, then opt them out. Otherwise, have them take the assessment. My child takes the assessments because I see no reason to opt her out. So she takes the assessments. That said, if she was a struggling learner and I knew that she would be frustrated, then would I be open to opting her out? Yeah, I can see myself being open to opting her out. It's very individual. So I'm not going to encourage people to opt out. I'm not going to discourage people to opt out. The only thing I ask of parents is I don't want any organized movement to opt out. Keep it a personal decision. So I'm not going to organize anything for or against, as long as it maintains a personal decision. So I just want a healthy balance with all of this. I don't want to sell out for it. I don't want to sell out against it. I think there are good things that can happen with the assessments. I think there are some god-awful things that can happen with the assessments, and I don't want to see either of those happen. I would love to see us test less. I don't see it happening. Even with ESSA, I don't see us testing less, unfortunately. So I'd love to know where the board is.
So I would say, I agree with every word that you said. What I don't understand, and this was great information, it was presented as factual. We had a presentation last year, Barry did, with some of this information. What I feel like I never understand is when we have time, so 6 months from now could be the March academic standards meeting. Come back, tell me when you looked at me, what you took away that was good and bad. That's the piece that's missing for me. Okay, I get it, this is all the facts, we have to present the facts, anybody can see them. But if I'm not gonna take a stand against it, I never really get to understand, like, okay, well, when somebody did dive into it, what did we walk away with? That's what I was trying to say tonight. Tonight may be too early, you just got the information, it's a lot of work. If you send that letter around about they should do the district work, I will send it to everybody in public office, no problem. But I just would like a follow-up meeting when somebody has, whatever time period that is, when you said, this part wasn't valuable, so we didn't really do anything with that. This part I saw, oh, 3rd grade math, we thought we had an issue, but look, we did great. Like, that's the kind of tangible things I'm trying to, and in 9 years, I don't doubt that it's probably gone on, but it never comes back here. You guys do the work, and so that's why I'm a little frustrated with, okay, I have the facts again, but I'm not the professional. I don't know what message I'm supposed to be taking away from it. Where are we doing super great, and where are we gonna take action based on the data we saw, if we're gonna take the test?
Or to build on that, I think what we've done a wonderful job over the last 3 years is focusing that kind of question on our operation. What we need to do is take that same approach to our academic performance. You know, we've got some new eyes in the district over the last few years. And I think what I hear from my peers is a bias toward action and a willingness to invest against that action. So if you don't have the capacity to get to it fast enough, as an example, because we don't have the capacity or the horsepower to get there, now speaking for me, tell us what you need to get there, so we can actually then feel good about then making investments and feel good telling the public, these are the investments we're making, these are why it's worthwhile. It's grounded in data. Here's why certain data points do matter. Here's why certain data points don't. And setting up, hey, over the next 5 years, this is how we march to whatever the right number for you is based on the analysis of the data. And again, going back to my key point here is if we don't have the capacity or the expertise to get to it today, I'd like to hear what we need, and I'd like for us to put that in place so we can make the same kind of progress against a specific plan that I think we're doing on the operational end. It's not enough to just do one.
We gotta advocate for just testing in 4th and 8th. I feel like everybody you talk to agrees, well, where these people are that.
Thank you.
Well, I thought when the legislature agreed to take away the graduation requirement, that was the first political step I saw away from testing, wasn't it? I just checked. Do you remember a publication, a paper published in 1999 by Paul Barton at ETS? It was called Too Much Testing. I mean, this goes back. I was working there then. This goes back years and years, and you know the trend has never changed. But if we could do something in that direction.
Susan, could I ask a question? And Barry as well, all three of you really. How long did this take?
All of it?
You should have data 5 weeks, right?
I mean, I think it
It's not
will
easy
help
work.
us have a frame of reference of what it really looks like and what it really entails and what we really hired you for, what we have all of you here for, and this is important, and everything else is important, and it would at least help me to know what this takes, and that would set a more realistic time frame.
It's hard. What took the longest to calculate with a state ranking data, because of what we get from the state, as Robert said, the state doesn't do that anymore. They don't give us any of the district data. They give us a set of data that if you go onto the PDE website, you can access this data. It's public. So one, we have to wait until they release it publicly to do anything with it. And what they actually give us is just the percentage of students who are advanced and proficient in every school. So every school, every grade level in that school, and they further delineate into 2 categories, all students and historically underperforming students. And in order to truly look at this data on a level playing field, you can't average percentages together. So what I had to do was, they give us the total number of students tested. So I had to calculate all the data back to the raw score of the number of kids that earned each proficiency level, and then start to do the calculations of ranking and figure out ranking by district, and then ranking by grade across every subject. So when Robert talks about weekends, yes, Saturdays and Sundays, evenings, working on this in the evenings, it really, trying to work through this data. And I will say that from my personal knowledge base, I'm pretty good with Excel, but I'm not an expert. I feel very fortunate to have, someone like Bob Reinhardt in our district who I could reach out to and ask him to help me figure out a faster way to do this. And even after he showed me the faster way to do it, it still took a significant amount of time to really analyze all these data and look into them.
So in other districts, we've had the conversation about being understaffed at the administrative level. I'm just going to ask the question. The kind of, not the analytical piece, but the data farming piece, do districts of our size typically have like an analyst type position? I'm not talking about,
You have someone in charge
at
of
a much
assessment.
at a much lower price point that would be more the data crunching.
No, it's an administrator. It's not that kind of person typically. So it's someone in charge of data analysis, assessment, accountability, that type of job.
So there's not a real delineation between data analysis and pulling the information. It sounds like it's just not there. You have to put it together before you can actually analyze it. That sounds like a big piece of work. So my question is around, can we be more efficient or more supportive in having a resource that at least pulls it together so you're not spending your time on the weekends?
No, but I think what Robert's looking for is
That's
how much do we
interesting.
want it? How much do we want it? I
That's
think we
what
still
I
should look
I just said I wanted
into
a lot, so I'll stop.
Well, I think, look, there are cultural things that are come into play here as well. I mean, our prior administration was nothing about data and nothing about this testing. And I just want to find something in the middle. I don't want all of you so stuck in the weeds of data. I'm appreciative for the work that you did here, and it probably was also helpful to you in terms of being new.
Absolutely.
And so, but there's got to be something in the middle of all of this.
Balance.
Right, well, we have to say, what are we gonna do before we spend all that time? Like, it's hard to say that, because you don't know what you want to get at the end until you start, but it's almost like,
I mean, that's
you spend
exactly-
all that weekend, we have the data, and now what? Like, I don't even know if it's enough to take action on, like, it's more work yet, and so I definitely don't want you to do more work unless we have a definitive place we're headed.
Well, I heard action in the sense that we've got some data points and now we're working within the schools through PLCs to drive consistency. And that work within the schools is also blending across the districts. We'll see more consistency in that standard
Yes.
across schools. I mean, that's a big deal alone
Yes.
to start that.
But we were doing work in the PLCs anyway.
Yeah, but this is a good metric to see the
Yeah, measurement.
effectiveness.
No,
of
understanding how
those.
that impacts this is,
So if I saw the
That should
action
help
items
us.
correctly, they're delving into what's most important. They're not using the test scores. Maybe I misunderstood.
They're using standards.
They're using the standards. They're
Yes.
not using the scores,
no, but you put the two together, you can figure out what's worth impacting.
right? But they're not using.
But part of it, right, you're right, Wendy, but part of what they're doing right now, it's not, the work they're doing right now is not about analyzing our test scores.
Right,
The
it's
work
about,
they're doing right now
which
is about
standards are
getting
important.
clarity of purpose on what is most important for
Right.
our Council Rock students to know and be able to do.
I can understand. So my point is they're not using.
So they decide what's most important and they
Right.
do it. How do you know they did it well?
Well, then they're gonna have to go back and analyze this, but they're not gonna use the analytics that I'm just trying to say, if we're gonna spend tons of time on it, let's make sure we have a clear purpose on why,
But
what we're trying to
I
get to.
do think that there are outliers in the data that are red flags that help direct those conversations.
That'd be great to
And
hear
so
about.
that's how that data gets used.
Right, and that'd be great to hear about.
Well, so you asked for feedback and to respond to something that Mike just said. So the premise, if you're gonna use these tests, everyone's picked the standards that are important. We focus on those. If those aren't on the test, then I can't use the test.
Correct.
So, we have to state whether we believe that these tests cover curriculum that we as a community care about. And if they don't, then everything falls apart here. And so I need to know that we actually care, that it's connected to stuff that we want to teach. And then how are we going to use data and PLCs in a sensible, balanced way and resource it? And so that's all the stuff that has to come together, because to just say, we'll walk away from the tests, we can't say that tonight, because we haven't talked about the value of the tests and the connectivity to our curriculum. And so I can't give you the feedback because I don't know. I mean, you guys have to decide whether those tests actually fit what we want to teach.
Well,
If we're gonna measure, if we're gonna make these measurements, let's do something with it. That's my.
Or just,
We're gonna consider we don't have any choice.
Consider we don't have any choice, can we get some value out of these tests? Listen.
And I can tell you that the work that the teachers are doing right now with prioritizing the curriculum, if you remember, I mentioned in the presentation, the action steps, how the tests are divided into categories of content.
Right.
So the teachers are looking at that. So it's called eligible content, meaning it's on the test. And so when they are making decisions about what's most essential, that's one of the factors that they're looking at. Is this eligible content? If it is, do we believe it needs to be essential learning? So they're making those choices as they're doing this work as a grade level for the tested areas.
but
So-
what you don't want to have happen is, because it becomes teaching for the test, oh, that's eligible content, so therefore we're going to teach it, but we actually, as professionals, don't think that it has any value. So it's, I don't know how you make sure that we don't suddenly have that test guiding our decisions as to what to exclude or exclude.
Well, and I think the key here is that's one of the factors they're looking at. That's not the only thing they're looking at. But in the process of unpacking those data, unpacking those standards, they're really unpacking what it means for a student to do that. So, for example, in sixth grade, they decided as a sixth grade team that 2 essential things for all sixth graders to know and be able to do are to be able to write an informative piece, which in sixth grade translates into the research that they do, and also to be able to write an argumentative piece, which is the ability to make a claim about something and support that claim with facts and quotes or whatever, and also to start to present a counterclaim and refute that counterclaim. And the reason they picked those 2 things is multi-purpose. First of all, those 2 types of writing are critical types of writing beyond high school. Because in most of your life after high school, unless you have a deep desire to be a novelist, you're not going to write narrative. But in every field that you go into professionally, the ability to write an informative kind of piece where you're reporting on something and you report on it in a factual way, or to write an argumentative piece where you're making a claim or an opinion about something and to be able to support that, those are 2 very important types of writing. So because those types have a lot of endurance over time and readiness beyond that grade, in addition to the fact that they also happen to be eligible content on the PSSA. So on the PSSA Language Arts Assessment, students are given a cold writing prompt. And that writing prompt could be one of 3. It could be a narrative prompt, it could be an argumentative prompt, or it could be an informational prompt. So they need to be able to be skillful at writing multiple types of writing. So those two essential learnings are things that have value well beyond the test, but they also are things that are tested. And so that's kind of the work that the teachers are doing. They're not just picking something because it's eligible content. They're making choices about what's essential based on what is important for our students when they leave us or as they progress up the grade levels. Like they need to know this in 4th grade first in order to be able to do this in 6th grade. So that's what's driving their decisions. It's multiple things.
So and then can you back out of these pieces of data, your district tests, did we deliver that to every student? I mean, it's one thing to say this is what we need. Now the goal is, did we do it? And how do we measure that?
Yes.
Consistently across the district. That's the piece that.
Yes.
That's question 2.
That's question 2. And that's where the data comes in. Some, maybe not this data.
Right.
You know, so there's got to be a yardstick of some sort.
Yes.
Admittedly, not as accurate as we'll ever want, but.
Yes.
So it goes back to what do you need from us to figure out where you want to go or to support what you're already doing? And then what investments do we need to make to get there?
Any other questions? Public comment?
Go ahead.
It's just,
The pressure.
it's just, well, I can't split the data. I feel maybe somewhat solutioned. Just, I mean, like, that's something that I was saying, like, it seemed dire to me, like, and then like you're talking, and then you guys are talking about how the data, well, there are problems in like the measurements. It's just, it's confusing.
It's called bureaucracy.
It is.
Government
And it's
bureaucracy.
very frustrating because.
Welcome to public life.
Yeah, I mean, it's very frustrating because you're trying to make, at the heart of this is everybody's working to try to give students the best education and continuously improve. And there's all kinds of stuff that is so much bigger than that simple, singular focus. It is very, very frustrating.
I think that we should keep in mind that, well, I mean, in my perspective, it doesn't really matter so much that we are one of the best school districts. I mean, it's,
How do you know that?
what?
How do you know we're one of the best school districts?
No,
You don't
she's asking,
understand.
does it matter?
I mean, how do we know we're one of the best school districts?
I mean, I just think that it's more important that the students are reaching the standards that we think are important. Like, well, that's their, like, going back to like the pieces like math, like that's if math, the math standards are important and the good standards, and then like not so many of our students actually meet those standards. I mean, that's what we have to work on.
I think you just touched on what to me is the most important thing, which is not how well are we doing as a district, but are we failing to properly educate some of our students in some certain subject areas or some schools. To me, that's the most efficient, is making it, most important is make sure we don't have any, trying to identify any major deficiencies. It's sort of like looking for problems is to me a big part of.
Right, but it's just goals. You know, you want to do better. How is it measured? What is your goal? And one thing that's interesting, because as you say that, it makes me realize that if you just take this conversation and you can think that this is the only goal that we have, then it's really misrepresenting what Council Rock is, because it's not just about tests. You know, this is the agenda item for today, but I can certainly speak for everybody at the table that we consider Council Rock to be a successful district based on a lot of other things that can take into account the social, the emotional, and every other part of a student's experience. The extracurriculars, our community service, it's everything. Tonight's agenda item was just simply this. So, it's unfair to characterize it. This is not like the end all be all goal, but we have many goals, and this is improving our performance is always a goal. And unfortunately, these are among the metrics that we have. There are others as well, because we do district tests and other things that we look at ourselves within our district. But to get a context of where we stand in the state and how we compare to others, like it or not, this is what we got. So.
And we're by law required.
And by law required, right. Meeting adjourned.